Well, good afternoon, good afternoon. I'm searching for growth. But Agregatum, Dendrobium. I'm not anticipating bloom spikes. I'm sure would have already probably had them by now. But they did not get a dry winter rest. But they sure are putting out a lot of those new growths and roots everywhere. Just everywhere. They were hanging in my grow room here in the same spot. Now I just moved it up here actually. They've been hanging down here. The other one's right here. The other one's hanging here. And I know they need a dry, cool winter rest to bloom. And I was not anticipating blooms. I'm more interested in growths. But and I've spoke about that before in a video, why I put everybody into growth mode. But those plants hung there all winter long. They hung in this bright light, 80-degree temperatures, lots of humidity, great environment for growth, and not a single root tip, not a single green root tip. All right, and they've gotten water. They haven't gotten watered very often because they're not supposed to. They're supposed to have a fairly dry winter rest. I'm sure because the rain stops where they come from. I imagine that's what the dry winter rest means, is that the rains cease where they live. They get moisture from the dew, from the fog, the mist in the air, but not really nutrients, just moisture. And so that's all they got. Was every once in a while I dipped them in the rain barrel and they got a little moisture, and to keep them from getting too desiccated, too dry. And they did. They hung in there real well. The other one did the exact same thing. But then one afternoon I said, I'm going to go ahead and see what happens, and I dropped them into my nutrients because it's starting to get springtime. But my plants inside, they don't know it's spring. They've had these same temperatures and same environment for the last 5 months. They don't have any idea it's spring. They're not reacting like it's spring. They've been growing this same way for 5 months. But when I dropped this plant and the other one in the nutrients, almost in 48 hours I had roots popping out all over, and then within a week or 10 days I had these new shoots starting to pop out all over the place too on both of them. And I've said before, I'm new to orchids. I haven't spent that much time with them. The roots on a tomato plant or a pepper plant grown in hydroponics are not the same thing as a orchid root. I have no experience at all with epiphytic type roots and epiphytic growing plants. That's a different type of structure. However, all plants use nutrients the same, pretty much, but adapting like nutrients that you would feed. And that's where my hydroponic experience comes from, was bedding plants, leafy green vegetables, peppers, tomatoes, that type of stuff also. I know the importance of nutrients and calcium and how they all work together with those type of plants, but how to put that with orchids, with all the different environmental stimulation they require, and with all the really odd little unique growing habits every one of them has, it's been different. But I think I'm finally figuring out a few things and learning how these plants grow. And some of that, when we're trying to get them to bloom or keep them in that winter period, you try and mimic natural conditions. That's why people with dendrobiums, I believe, move them out of the greenhouse, move them out of the grow room and put them into cooler areas, put them in another part of the house or their grow room or someplace where they get bright lights. From what I understand, these get bright light because the trees they grow on are deciduous, and so in the wintertime the leaves would fall off and they would get really bright light. The rest of the time of the year it would be shade, a little bit more shade or filtered. It stops raining so they get a dry period, and it's cooler. All right. My plants did not get a cool environment. They just got they didn't really get the dry period, but they didn't get any nutrients. So they got the same kind of dry period as they would have gotten in the natural habitat. temperatures were warm though. They did get the bright light, but not a bit of growth until I gave them nutrients. And you know, my experience is not with orchids, so because they grow so different, it's hard to understand how they utilize those nutrients and what triggers things. Triggering growth in a tomato plant or a pepper plant is a lot different than trying to trigger growth in one of these. But again, if you know how the nutrients react in these, and that's where it's getting crazy. It's helped me understand. How to feed my plants, how to answer the questions when people answer a question, if I could answer them, and physically answer them. But it's really made a difference in how I've understood how to feed these and how they take nutrients in, and some of the things you have to consider and think about. And you know, I never realized the importance of immobile nutrients and in how they work with orchids. I think that's the secret to growing secret to growing orchids is immobile nutrients. I really believe that. One of my favorite YouTube channels, Deborah Woodrow in New Zealand. She's a wonderful host, has a beautiful garden, beautiful orchids. She has a grower's heart. I was talking to her in comments one afternoon, and she mentioned that an older grower, an experienced grower at one of her shows or her club meetings or something had to do with Orchids Society or something like that, said that the secret to orchid growing was calcium. And I remember that, and I was one of those people that really didn't listen to my elders as I was growing up. I didn't pay attention when they told me stuff, and you don't realize until they get older that you realize, that was, most of that stuff was gold. You probably should have paid attention to it. You would have made less mistakes in your life, probably, right? So I took it to heart, and I realized the importance of calcium in other plants and growing in the hydroponics, how it's very, very important, especially that the calcium and nitrogen ratio. So I dove into calcium and orchids and started discovering all kinds of things. And then when I started putting it with how they actually grow in their habitats and some of the things that happen, it makes sense now. It's starting to come together. I really think I can do a couple more shows, and I think everybody should have all the parts and pieces they should have to know how to grow these orchids. I know I'm pretty much getting close to that point. Again, it's understanding the basics of it, and then I can take it from there. Over the next couple of years or whatever time I have left, whatever I develop with the orchids and with the plants, won't be years, but whatever I develop with the plants and the nutritional, what I continually build up in my, routine, how I'm treating the plants and the nutrients that I'm giving them, everything, develop it over the next, what little bit of time, it will all benefit the plants greatly, I think. And I think it'll help everybody, including the people who are watching this in the long run. That's really all once I started getting into this channel, that became the goal, and if I can get that goal accomplished, then I'm pretty much finished here. I'd like to keep my channel going, but there's some things going on that I need to talk to everybody about. I'm not going anywhere right at the moment, but I need to sit down and have a talk with everybody one afternoon here very quickly. Regardless, getting back to the immobile nutrients, and I'll use this as an example, like Dendrobium aggregatums. They hang on those trees in the wild. In nature, they're hanging on a tree, and they're not getting any rain, so they're not getting any nutrients. Correct? The mist and the fog and everything, that's not going to bring a whole lot of nutrients with them. There might be some residual there, but there's not going to be a whole lot of anything else. So, and I'm using my plants as an example and how they reacted. They didn't do anything, and they got bright light. They never did grow. They got water, but they still didn't grow. They were in warm temperatures, and they still didn't grow. And if you think about it, Dendrobium aggregatums in their natural habitat, when the springtime comes around, is it the warmth? Is it the additional light because the light gets more intense? Is that what triggers it? The longer days, is that what triggers them to grow and start blooming? Yes and no. Warmth and temperatures, light, things like that will trigger hormones. That'll trigger proteins, hormones. But hormones don't move through the plant and won't develop in don't form unless they have the proper nutrients. So in order to get the hormones to tell the plant to bloom or to keep growing or to start growing, they have to have the proper nutrients. And that's what I'm getting around to. In their natural habitat, these plants, I think, probably get, very little moisture, just enough to keep them from being desiccated. The cooler temperatures, obviously, but mine didn't react like that. Mine reacted as soon as they got nutrients. And then you have to ask yourself, there's nutrients in the plant, in those bulbs, the canes, right? Reserves. There's reserves here. So why doesn't the plant grow when it has reserves? It's in all the books. You read it in all the books. I hear people talk about it. I heard it on a actual garden. It was a television station, garden channel the other day on TV, where somebody mentioned that orchids grow from the reserves. But if orchids do grow from the reserves, and again, this is just my take, what point do immobile nutrients come into play? Where do immobile nutrients come into reserves? Mobile nutrients can be moved around. Immobile nutrients, once they're absorbed by the plant, that's it. They're set. They're done. They're finished. So if they grow from the reserves, where do the immobile nutrients come from? They're not moving those around themselves. You see what I mean? If you ask why to some of those things that should trigger your thinking, at least it does mine. It does mine. So when I delve into it and I start thinking about it, why do the immobile nutrients do that? If that aggregatum is hanging on a tree and it hasn't gotten any rain for a while, it hasn't gotten any nutrients at all. It has reserves. It has mobile nutrients. It has the NPK and magnesium and things of that nature all throughout it. But without that calcium, that cell structure to be able to stack those growths up, they won't start growing. So as soon as it starts raining in the springtime, it's not the temperature so much, it's that rain that comes back in the springtime. It brings an influx of nutrients down the tree, and they start getting those immobile nutrients that they haven't been exposed to, the roots haven't had exposure to for 4 or 5 months. And once they have got that calcium, then the immobile nutrients, then they can take the immobile nutrients and use their reserves if they need to and start growing again. But on a side note, I don't ever want my plants to grow from reserves. To me, that's like the bank account. That's only for emergencies. I don't want them to use any nutrients from their reserves. But I'm not trying to go against hundreds of years of orchid growing experience and history and what the books say and everything, but orchids do not grow from the reserves. They use the reserves, yes, but they don't grow from the reserves. They need the reserves. They use the reserves in an emergency. But again, I don't want mine to grow from the reserves. If I'm giving them enough nutrients, they won't have to get into the reserves. They shouldn't get into the reserves unless they're not getting enough nutrient flow past them. Just to get, once again, just my intake, my take on it, and my opinion. To me, that makes sense with those aggregatums. That's what triggered mine to start growing. It wasn't the temperature or the light, because they've had temperature and light for 5 months. And that didn't change. Nothing has changed in here, because I haven't been up on a ladder. My timers are actually up towards the ceiling, and I can't get to them without a ladder. I can change the timers easy, but I haven't because of my back. It's not a good idea to get on a ladder and do stuff when you're just had back surgery. So, and nothing's wrong in here. Everything's working fine. So I kind of left it alone. So that didn't change, and that's why they weren't growing. Nothing happened. But the moment they got immobile nutrients, boom, they took off and started growing. And then if you adapt that to in the wild, where these plants hang in the wild, it does the same thing. I'm convinced that's got to be what it is, the influx of immobile nutrients that flow back down to the tree. If that region where these are growing, if they have, and this again, my opinion, if the rains come a month late, they don't get their monsoons, or the rain doesn't come and it remains dry for another month, I bet these plants don't start growing. I bet they don't fully start taking off. They may get a little bit of growth coming out because there might be some residual, not reserves, there's a big difference, residual calcium left on the tree or on the mount or hopefully on your pot or something like that. But on a tree in the wild, they have elements like that exposed to them all the time. They just need a little water to flush them down to them. In our environment, in our enclosed environments, home, we have to provide that stuff. They only get calcium when you give it to them. It's not like there's calcium in the rock, or, well, I use rock and stone and stuff, and there is calcium in that, but there's not a lot of calcium in dead bark. There's not a lot of calcium in sphagnum moss. They need the nutrients. They need those immobile nutrients to trigger that, if that makes sense. And again, just my take. Just my take. But, you know, for me to tell you to use CalMag, that's helpful information. It'll help you grow. It'll make a big, big difference in your plants, but I don't think that helps you as much as if I explain to you why that calcium works, how that calcium works, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to be cocky or come off like I know everything, or this is the right way or the best way or anything like that. No. Again, just my take on things. That's all. When an orchid is growing and they're stacking that new shoot up, they're stacking all those cells up, stacking. That takes calcium. Every little cell structure has to have some calcium for those building blocks. The same with that root. All that calcium, every little tiny millimeter, that root has to have calcium stacking up. They can't get it from the reserves. They have to have it given to them all the time. All right? Same with the new leaves, the new bulbs, the new canes, any of the new shoots, the roots, and real important, and I think it gets left out of the equation a lot, is the flower spikes. Everybody's had an orchid that'll put up flower spikes, and they get about half grown or start to grow, and then they shrivel and die. It goes right back to this. It goes right back to immobile nutrients. And if you think about this, just for a second, I'm trying to get you to understand a concept, maybe, a different way of looking at it, maybe. If that nutrients are coming, and keep this in mind, if the nutrients are flowing down and they're flowing, it's an active growing plant, the new shoot's coming up and it runs out of calcium. Remember, the nutrients are still flowing. They're still flowing. They're still coming down that root. They're still flowing up the flower spike. They're still coming up the new growth, the new shoot, the new bulb or cane. And it concentrates in the tip. It concentrates in the tip of the roots, those little green and red tips. It concentrates in the tips of the shoots, the new bulbs, new canes, the new flower spikes. And when the calcium stops, because we're not feeding enough calcium, or the residual, not reserves because it's not part of the reserves, but the residual disappears because you flushed it out of the pot with water. They haven't had any water for 4 or 5 months because you've left them in a dormant state. Then you pour water on them and it flushes what little bit of calcium is left there. The calcium stops, but the nutrients are still coming. And research has shown that the tips, the little tips of roots, the tips of the new growths, the canes, the bulbs, the leaves, the flower shoots, spikes, buds, all contain more, they have a higher concentration of nutrients versus further down the cane or the bulb or the root, etc. And so when that calcium gets shut off because you're either not feeding calcium or the residual has disappeared, or because the pH has dropped too low out of the range of calcium. Calcium has a range of 5 to 5.8. Things like that can happen. So if you get out of the pH range, it won't be able to absorb calcium and the growth stops. And remember, the nutrients are still coming. The nutrients are still coming. And anybody who's grown orchids and given too much, or any plants for that matter, and fed high, made a mistake and mixed up their nutrients too strong, what happens? High concentrations of nutrients will burn tissue, plant tissue. It'll burn the root tips off. It'll burn the new shoots, the new leaves, the new growth. See what I mean? See how that works? See how that works? It's like, and I didn't mean to just ramble on here today. It's like the store-bought phalaenopsis. Once I figured out how that happens to them with the moss, now it's very, very simple to not only prevent it in my own orchids, but I know how to treat it now. So I can buy a phalaenopsis in moss and pull it out of that rotten moss, and it can have dead roots and bad roots, or a cattleya, or an oncidium, or a dendrobium, or any of these other plants that all were in moss when I bought them, most of them, rescues and bag babies. These two dendrobiums that I'll talk about in a minute, that just showed up here. Beautiful, beautiful plants. That's black burgundy, and this is Arana jade yellow. But they're all in that moss, and that's so common. And that's one of the biggest issues. Everybody who bought their first orchid or so was in that moss. You get it home and it's got aerial roots coming out that look real nice. You get that phalaenopsis with the aerial roots that look really, really pretty. They've got tips on them. You get it home and you take it out of the moss and it's just a dark, sodden, rotten mess of nothing, right? Everybody's been there. Everybody's been there. I still go there every once in a while because sometimes that's the best orchids to buy. I don't mind buying a sick orchid now that I understand a few things. Let me back up. I don't mind buying a nutritionally deficient orchid, not a sick one. There's a big difference. A nutritionally deficient orchid now, because I know how to correct that. But those phalaenopsis in moss, and I'm not bad-mouthing moss. I use moss all the time. It's a great product. But I'm trying to get you to understand a point. They're in moss. It's 5.3, 5.4 to begin with, right out of the package fresh. That dry moss is. You're putting orchid nutrients or hydroponic nutrients on it in the nursery where they grow those plants and get them ready for commercial market. And it's in moss. And once the moss starts to decay a little bit, the pH drops again. So you're 5.3, 5.4 out of the package. You're putting nutrients on it that lower the pH. And as it starts to degrade from exposure to sun or light in the room or light in your greenhouse or at your house, fungi, bacteria, etc., the moss breaks down, the pH drops lower. Very quickly you're out of that 5.0 to 5.8 range that calcium is absorbed. See what happens? And when you get below that pH range and the calcium can't be absorbed anymore, the growth stops, the nutrients keep coming, and it kills off the soft tissue, it kills off the roots, kills off the new shoots, the new growths. That would explain, if you think about it for just a second, and again, this is just my take and just how I look at things, but this is what's helped me to grow. Having somebody say, use MSU or use Better Grow or do this or do that, that helps, but it's, knowing why helps even more, I think. Again, just my take. But that kind of helps you understand why you have aerial roots that look fine out of the pot, and down below it's dead. They're not exposed to the conditions. They're still able to absorb calcium because if they were to actually get exposed to it, and immobile nutrients. It's not just calcium on its own, but that is a big, big one because calcium and nitrogen have such a heavy relationship together. All right, but you can apply that not to just those horribly treated phals that we love to buy, but any of those plants that you buy that are in moss, that's the problem with it. That's why you lose those flower spikes. When the plants start to bloom in the spring and they drop those spikes, or that new shoot starts to die back and turns black, and then what happens is you get decay sets in, bacteria sets in, decay sets in, and they call it what? Black rot. In the springtime, the new shoots come out down in Florida. Here, that happens all the time. Warm environment like that. It's not the environment that causes it. Decay or rot or bacteria setting in on dead tissue is perfectly normal. That's how things are eaten up and reabsorbed by Mother Nature. That's just the end result of it dying. Again, you go all the way back to the beginning and ask why. Why did it die? When somebody says, "Oh, that's black rot," nope, I don't follow that. Black rot's the end result. That's just a natural process of something dying. If that makes sense, again. You can keep going on with these and keep going on and keep going on and adapting that mentality, that kind of thinking, rationality of how the nutrients are used. To me, that's really, really important. I'll give you another real quick example. That was Dendrobium aggregatum, what we hit on phals and other plants in moss and everything. Another one that I see all the time, which didn't take but a few minutes to sit there and think about and realize, I think I know what's going on with that too. I love I love to watch all the shows. I'm way behind on shows and talking to people. My apologies. Todd and Libby, I love you with all my heart. Just y'all sit tight, please. I'm dealing with some issues, but we'll talk soon. Catasetums, and I don't have any. I love them. I think they're beautiful, beautiful plants. I'm curious about them because I want to get some, but I don't want to buy something because I've got so much going on now. I don't want to buy something that I've got to learn all over again how to take care of them. And I see this issue in the springtime. They go into a dormant state in the wintertime. That's their natural habitat. They go to a dormant state, drop their leaves, just these little shriveled bulbs sticking up in the pot. They're gorgeous looking little clumps of these bulbs. And in the springtime, they put out that new little shoot and new little new little roots. And then I start to hear those myths again, those orchid myths. Don't water it because you have to wait till the roots get a certain length or it'll kill the plant. It'll kill the shoots, or it'll kill the roots, or it'll kill it. And I see it all the time too. I see that it happening all the time. Again, I'm looking at things differently. That's not natural. When you water a plant and it dies, that's trying to tell you something. So I looked at it as, I got to find out why. It's like keikis on dendrobiums. I had to figure this out the other day, and now I know why dendrobiums grow keikis. It took a little bit of research, but I finally figured it out. And I had to sit down and think about it for a second with a cup of coffee. But back to the Catasetums. We can't cover it all today. It's just not enough time. But back to Catasetums, the same thing. They go very dormant for a long period of time, and that bulb gets extremely shriveled, desiccated, and that's normal. That's supposed to happen. That's part of the triggering process with concentrating hormones and things of that nature. Hormones will concentrate when a bulb or something loses its fluid. Does that make sense? When it loses, its liquid inside, it'll concentrate what nutrients it has in there, and proteins and hormones, etc., etc. When the Catasetums haven't had water for 4 or 5 months, and a little tiny shoot comes out, and little tiny roots come out, and it would only be able to do that if there's a little calcium residual, and so when you pour water on there, there's some residual there. It triggers that growing process. Those immobile nutrients coming in start triggering that growing process again. Now, warmth and light and stuff triggers hormones and proteins, which tell it to start growing, but it can't grow if it doesn't have calcium. So even if there's a little residual there, and it starts the little shoot and the little roots, and you water it and it dies, it's telling you that what's happening is you're giving it water, it's rehydrating that bulb, and when you rehydrate the bulb, you stimulate the fluids to start pumping through the plant again, because all of a sudden now it's got liquid again in it. When it's doing that, it increases the flow of nutrients to those new canes, new shoots, new roots, new bulbs. Remember a few minutes ago, down over here, we were talking about that? And you pour water on it, it rinses whatever residual calcium is left in the pot. If you're not adding CalMag or putting calcium in your nutrients, or your nutrient mix doesn't contain calcium, or maybe the media has broken down so it's acidic enough to where calcium can't be absorbed, and you give it water so the calcium can't be absorbed or isn't present, the water triggers that plant to start growing, sending those nutrients. Nutrients accumulate in the ends of the tips of the roots and in the tips of the shoots, and what happens? It kills it. See what I mean? To me, and that's again just my opinion, but if I had some Catasetums, and I may one day, we'll see, but if I had some Catasetums, before I knew they were getting ready to start growing, before they were starting to grow, one, I'd make sure their media wasn't broken down and had gone too acidic, because I think that's a big mistake. In inert medias, I don't have that issue, so I wouldn't have to worry about that part of it. But in the springtime, if I had Catasetums and I was just sitting there looking at these dormant bulbs, I would give them some straight up CalMag and water. All right, with maybe some very, very tiny nutrients, and maybe not even that for the first couple of waterings, because the nutrients in that plant, some of the reserves, and that's only the mobile part of it, is concentrated. I don't really want to trigger a bunch of growth with concentrated nutrients just yet. Let the bulbs hydrate a little bit more, get a little more plump, and you'll kind of dilute that down a little bit if it makes sense too. Being desiccated, they can't flow nutrients, proteins, hormones, etc. properly to help stimulate the stuff. So that's way too much rambling, isn't it? Just way too much rambling. I was not planning that when I came out here. I just start talking about nutrients and I get carried away. I've gone back and looked at some of my old videos and I hate them. I may redo a couple of them because I'm coming off very, very aggressive, almost like I'm trying to scold people. And I've never realized it because I don't go back and watch my videos too often. If somebody says, hey, your video's upside down or something like that, I would, but if I had a bunch of people saying, hey, you're screaming and yelling at everybody, why are you doing that? I probably would have noticed it more. I'm trying to pay attention to that stuff. I get worked up, I get going, and it's part of the issue that is coming on. So these two dendrobiums, real quick before I go, wasted everybody's time already. These two dendrobiums, beautiful, beautiful plants. I pulled these out of a dump bin, a great big dump bin at Lowe's. It was full of orchids. These were $15 a piece. So I got one free. Buy one get one free for these. They were in the same moss bundle like I just spoke about that the phals come in. Same issues, same condition. That one actually has a little tiny growth on it. I'm going to try and keep it going with some light calcium, but they show every sign of acidic media and can't absorb calcium. So they've had their roots cleaned off. I put them in the moss immediately, and that's another, and just my take again, that's another reason to not leave a plant when you get it home and wait till it finishes blooming to remove it from the media. I don't even want to go 48 hours without removing it from the media, unless I know for a fact that it's not broken down. I can really tell. I can really tell. This stuff was black. It was like potting soil. I could tell it was gone. And I anticipated bad roots, but one of the dump bins probably had, oh man, 200 bag babies in it that were all so desiccated. I wouldn't have even tried to rescue them. And they were moving stuff around, so that they're bringing new stuff in, and these had to go. And horrible. I'll show them more later on as they get settled in. This is Piranha. They're in the wrong tags. They got the wrong tags in the wrong pot. I just noticed. Good. I'm glad I noticed that. Piranha Jade Yellow. I'm glad I noticed that. But really nice fat bulbs. The leaves are a little bit on the desiccated side, so I put some clips on to hold them up as they fill up with a little bit more moisture. Not a really desiccated, more of a nutrient issue, I think. Not able to hydrate itself, I think, is more the issue. You know, we talked about that moss just a second ago. I was just talking about that. That's why when you get a plant and it looks wilted, it needs water and it's all dehydrated, but it's sitting in sopping wet moss. You wonder, well, why is it dehydrated when it's sitting in wet, soppy, wet moss? That's why. Immobile nutrients. So, way too much rambling today. I appreciate everybody listening and being polite. Thank you again for all the kind comments and thoughts, prayers. I appreciate it. It means the world to me. I'm going to get back to watering, I guess, and looking plants over and getting my game plan. Have a wonderful evening, and thanks again for watching.